By the way, you don't have to drop imputed guilt, or you can actually believe imputed guilt and still be a provisionist and still hold to the common beliefs of us. Why? Because we don't believe imputed guilt necessitates imputed inability to confess that guilt. Okay, so you can be one who holds to imputed guilt. You're just born guilty, but you're still able to confess that guilt and that corruption and that condition in light of what God sends, the law and the gospel. Okay, so
provisionists, they welcome both sides of the aisle when it comes to imputed guilt, but what's your view, Leighton?
in other words, this is not
We want to know your view.
a huge point of contention as it seems that Collin want to make it to be, because you can actually hold to imputed guilt and still be a provisionist by all at least all the important distinctions that we would have with regard to these issues.
Now, this is really interesting. Like if he's going to go down this road and say that, well, you can affirm in the imputed guilt of Adam and still be a provisionist, well, not according to your statement of faith, Leighton. Your statement of faith explicitly denies imputed guilt. It denies it. This is just an example of what I mentioned earlier, opening the gates. Like, where do you start to draw the line? I mean, you also welcome open theists, right? Open theists can be provisionists, and yet open theists deny penal substitutionary atonement, which your statement of faith affirms, right? So how do you square that? Like, how do you start drawing the line as to what is necessary to be a provisionist and what isn't? And I think it sort of speaks to what I pointed out in our episode, and that was that as long as you're not a Calvinist, you're a provisionist, right? Or you can be a provisionist. What he's basically admitting here is that imputation of guilt isn't unjust. I get the impression he said that it is elsewhere. I mean, it's a pretty common argument against Calvinists that imputed guilt would be, unjust. Yet when it's pointed out that it's inherent in the gospel, so on and so forth, he basically just has to say, well, yeah, and at the end of the day, it's okay if you affirm it because you can still be a provisionist. And this list goes on and on. I mean, do you accept universalists, Leighton? Can universalists be provisionists? I recall your statement of faith also mentioning the reality of eternal separation from God. So how do you square that? And this is the danger of just throwing the gates open and saying, well, everybody can be a provisionist, and sort of minimizing some of these critical issues because, you might not think that the imputed guilt of Adam or the original sin is a big deal, but it is the very foundation of how we view man and their wills and their relationship to God, and which then leads into salvation as a whole. The other thing that this does is when you say, well, you can have both, right? You can either accept it, imputed guilt, or deny it. Well, then this sets up the inevitable, it's hard to pin things down, right? So if I point to a provisionist and say, hey, this guy affirms imputed guilt, well, then you say, well, I don't, right? Or, I've never said that, or you're misrepresenting provisionism now. Well, it's like, well, you kind of opened up the possibility for both, so is it or is it not a misrepresentation of provisionism, right? And so this is really where things start to get complicated as all these accepted views that you start to allow in begin to radiate outwards, then you're opening up more and more doors of potential quote unquote misrepresentation of provisionism, when really that's just the result of you accepting people from all sorts of views and giving the particular people impressions that that's what you believe, right? So if someone's first encounter with a provisionist is someone who affirms imputed guilt, and then they come across you and you deny it, well, there's going to be a little bit of confusion there, right? If someone's first impression of a provisionist is an open theist who denies that God knows the future and denies penal substitutionary atonement, and that's the impression they get of provisionism, and then they come across you, well, who's right? Are you the provisionist or are they? And so, I could go on and on with all these different sorts of issues. I'm just pointing out the danger in throwing the gates wide open and not really being strict about what you believe and what you're going to call provisionism. And that's why I think it's safer to just go with what your statement of faith says, right?